Do you remember if you listened to music back during the coronavirus lockdowns? If you did, you're amongst the about 50% of the general population who benefited from listening to music during the lockdowns. But we also know, of course, that people were under very different circumstances during this time. Some were in a positive mood state, some were in a negative mood state, and that influenced the coping behavior that people were engaged in. We also know that when we look at the music that was consumed during the lockdown, so for instance, looking at Spotify playlist, we can see a bifurcation between happy-go-lucky music and sad and reflective music. So a key question to ask here, I think, is to say, is it then the case that people in a negative mood state listen to mood congruent negatively valence music, and people in a positive mood state will listen to the happy corona music? We tried to answer this question by looking at a previous survey sample that we had from April and May 2020 from the general population in Germany, Italy, France, the UK, India, and the US. These respondents identified about 1,400 pandemic coping songs that we then extracted the Spotify audio features from. And then we ran k-means clustering on these to see how these musical repertoire grouped. And we also compared it to a lot of variables we had on people's lockdown-induced changes in their musical coping behaviors during this time. And if we look at the number one here, we can see that the music that people self-identified is actually very diverse. So most of these variables here, you can find data points spanning most of them. Of course, there are some skews here, especially for the popularity measures that we know from other research are typically governed by these power law structures. And we also see that there's generally low speechiness because people were asked to identify specifically music and so on. But otherwise, it's quite diverse, you could say. But once we look at how these repertoires group together, we can see that there are three main clusters. First of all, a popular music cluster, which is generally lively, but also is relatively recently released music and scores relatively high on the popularity of the artists and the tracks and the albums. Then we have a second cluster of lively music, which has a lot of the same musical characteristics, but scores lower on some of these popularity measures. And thirdly, we have the acoustic cluster, which scores lower on a lot of the energy-related variables like danceability and energy and so on, but scores very highly on acousticness. And when we then try to relate these three clusters of music to 6 factors that we have from a factor analysis looking at demographic variables, we can see that the only one of these factors that actually shows significantly differences between these clusters is the second one that relates to young age. So people who were generally young, those are also the ones who listen to the more recent and popular musical repertoire, whereas people who are relatively old in this sample are also those that are more likely to listen to the acoustic music sample. And that brings us to the main question. So can we show that there's a relationship here between this positive and negative emotion factors and then the music that people self-identified? And when we look at the valence of the music, we actually see no data in support of this hypothesis. But what we can see is that the people who score higher on the positive emotions scale, they're also likely to listen to popular tracks and cope via this musical coping style that we call social eudaimonia. So this has to do with creating identity and feeling meaning and being part of a social group and things like that. Whereas people who were in a negative mood state were more likely to pick live tracks and coped via this emotional self-regulation coping style, which is more internally directed. So here, for the first time, we see some very interesting relationships between the music that people listen to and the mood state that they were in during the lockdowns.